are watching The World 24/7 on the NDTV network. I'm Parmeshwar Bava. Here are the headlines we're tracking currently. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken is starting 3 days of talks with senior Chinese officials in Shanghai and Beijing, with US-China ties at a critical point over numerous global disputes. Columbia University cancelled in-person classes. Dozens of protesters were arrested at New York University and Yale, and the gates to Harvard Yard were closed to the public as some of the most prestigious US universities sought to diffuse campus tensions over Israel's war with Hamas. The UK Prime Minister has pledged to send arms worth $620 million to Ukraine. Meanwhile, the US Senate has given final approval to a $95 billion wartime aid package for Ukraine, Israel and Taiwan, with a bipartisan coalition that was eager to send the long-stalled package to Biden's desk.
America will always defend democracy.
NASA's Voyager 1 probe, the most distant man-made object in the universe, is returning usable information to ground control following months of spouting gibberish. This is what the US Space Agency has confirmed. Skies over southern Greece turned an orange hue as dust clouds blown across the Mediterranean Sea from North Africa engulfed the Acropolis and other landmarks. Well, a big focus, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken is starting 3 days of talks with senior Chinese officials in Shanghai and then in Beijing this week, with US-China ties at a critical point over numerous global disputes. Now, Antony Blinken's 3-day trip starting today comes after the approval of a $61 billion aid package for Ukraine by the US House, and in the midst of fears in Western capitals that Chinese aid to Moscow for manufacturing of military hardware is ramping up. This is also Antony Blinken's second trip to China after a high-stakes diplomatic mission to cool US-China tensions in June last year, and he is expected to hold meetings with senior Chinese officials that includes Foreign Minister Wang Yi. And joining us now, Laura Westbrook, live from Hong Kong. Thank you so much, Laura, for joining us on NDTV. You know, as Mr. Blinken heads to China, take us through the major divides he's going to try and bridge.
Yes, there has been some tough talk out of Beijing ahead of the visit by US Secretary of State Antony Blinken. Beijing really wanting to get its message out there ahead of that trip. We heard from the foreign ministry official who said that they wanted to make clear Beijing's stance on a number of issues, such as the South China Sea, where Beijing increasingly sees the US being in its backyard, for example, holding naval exercises, on the economy, as well as laying out its red lines, including Taiwan. Beijing is also very unhappy with US complaints of industrial overcapacity in manufacturing, particularly in these new energy industries. This foreign ministry official said that dismissed these allegations, calling them outright economic coercion and bullying. He also said that this behind it was an evil intention to suppress China's economic development. So ahead of these talks, we're really getting some tough talk out of Beijing, although they did say they want to also strengthen dialogue between these two superpowers.
Right. Also, Laura, you know, hours before Blinken's touchdown, the Global Times has actually published an article that preempts that Blinken is going to come to issue an ultimatum to China. And China seems in no mood to give in to him, his requests, as they assert that they will not compromise on their core issues.
Yes, I mean, we've just had a tweet on social media by Antony Blinken saying that as he heads to Shanghai and Beijing this week, that they will face intensive face-to-face diplomacy, ongoing direct engagement is vital for making progress on issues that matter most to the American people and the world. So that's from Antony Blinken ahead of this trip. And the US is really framing this trip as part of efforts to maintain communication and channels of communication with China. And we have seen increased dialogue, especially in the last month, with US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen's trip to China. There was also a phone call between President Xi Jinping and Joe Biden earlier this month that follows their meeting in San Francisco last year. And Antony Blinken will really have two key goals when he goes to China. The first of which is getting China on side in stopping Chinese companies providing support to Russia's war effort in Ukraine, and also de-escalating the growing conflict in the Middle East. Both of these areas China has a growing influence, but really it is about maintaining dialogue on the part of the US. Blinken will also bring up some human rights issues as well. So it really will be about striking a delicate balance on both sides, with both sides looking to put forward their point of view. But the US has said that having candid conversation and maintaining these channels of communication is really something that it sees as being vital.
In fact, Blinken has also said that China is Russia's primary contributor when it comes to industrial support for arms. I mean, from Russia and Ukraine to Israel, Iran, the broader Middle East, as well as the Indo-Pacific and trade issues, the US and China are on a series of collision courses that have sparked fears about military, strategic security, as well as international economic stability, Laura.
Yes, I mean, they are clearly divided on many issues, but I think from the US side, they will be trying to get China on side, particularly in influencing Russia when it comes to especially funding Chinese companies funding Russia's war efforts in Ukraine. I think the US will really be trying to bring China on side and hope that it uses its influence in that area with Russia, as well as in the growing conflict in the Middle East, where China also has a growing influence as well.
Well, Laura, Westbrook, thank you so much for joining us on NDTV. Really appreciate your insights into Blinken's touchdown in China. With that, let's turn our attention to the other big story we're tracking. What began last week when Columbia University students in the US refused to end their protest against Israel's war with Hamas had turned into a much larger movement as students across the United States set up encampments, occupied buildings, and ignored demands to leave. Protests have been bubbling for months but kicked into a higher gear after more than 100 pro-Palestinian demonstrators who had camped out on Columbia's Upper Manhattan campus were arrested. Now, dozens more protesters have been arrested at other campuses since, and many now face charges of trespassing or disorderly conduct. Take a look at the dramatic visuals playing out on your screens. With tensions at Columbia continuing to run high and some students afraid to set foot on the campus, officials said the Ivy League school will switch to hybrid learning for the rest of the semester, which will be finished by the end of next week. Now, as far as New York is concerned, at the New York University, police said 133 protesters were taken into custody late on Monday, and all had been released, with summons, though, to appear in court on disorderly conduct charges. Meanwhile, police arrested 60 protesters, including 47 students at Yale University, after they refused to leave an encampment on a plaza at the center of the Yale campus. Yale's president has said that protesters had declined an offer to end the demonstration and meet with trustees. After several warnings, school officials determined the situation was no longer safe, so police cleared the encampment and made arrests. As far as Harvard University in Massachusetts is concerned, they tried to stay a step ahead of protests by locking most gates into the famed Howard Yard and limiting access to those with school identification. In fact, the school has also posted signs that warn against setting up tents or tables on campus without permission. But you know, since the war in Gaza began, colleges and universities have struggled to balance safety with free speech rights, and many long-tolerated protests But now officials are doling out more heavy-handed discipline.
College protests continue to expand in the U.S. ever since multiple pro-Palestinian protesters were arrested at Columbia University's campus for setting up encampment and calling the university to divest all academic and economic stakes in Israel. In support of those who were arrested at Columbia, student groups in many universities, including Yale and New York University, began their own demonstrations. In response, officials are monitoring the situation closely. On Monday, more than 100 NYPD officers entered NYU's encampment and made over 130 arrests, although an official number is yet to be tallied. The university said it had warned the crowd to leave and called the police after the scene became disorderly. New York City's Mayor Eric Adams said that the city is working closely with the school to mitigate the crisis. He also added that a police officer was assaulted during the NYU protest, but that the helmet he was wearing protected him. He called the protesters who want to exercise their right to free speech to refrain from any violence. Students at MIT and UC Berkeley also set up tents to protest against the Israel-Hamas war. Columbia made its classes virtual until the semester ended, and Harvard closed its doors to people unaffiliated with the university. With only a few weeks left of the semester, many universities are struggling to contain the protests and mitigate tensions on campuses. I'm Nandini Gupta reporting for NDTV from New York.
In other news, the Lebanese group Hezbollah says it has launched drone attacks on Israeli bases in retaliation for the killing of one of its fighters, marking the deepest attack into Israeli territory since the Gaza war began. Now, Hezbollah launched a combined air attack using decoy and explosive drones that targeted 2 Israeli bases halfway between Acre and Nahariya. This is what the latest statement says. The Iran-backed group said it acted in retaliation for an earlier Israeli attack killing one of its fighters. It published what appeared to be a satellite photo with the location of the attack symbolized by a flash with a red circle around it. But the Israeli military said it had no knowledge of any of its facilities being hit by Hezbollah, but had said earlier that it had intercepted 2 aerial targets off Israel's northern coast. Joining us for a quick update, my colleague Mohammad Ghazali from outside the Israeli embassy. Thank you so much, Ghazali, for joining us on the World 24/7. Now, the Hezbollah says that this is the deepest attack inside Israel since Israel's war with Hamas began. Is that accurate?
Yeah, because these 2 cities you mentioned, city of Akko and Nahariya, is in the northern part of Israel, and it also shows that perhaps if the video footage has to be believed, what Hezbollah has released, that somewhere they have managed to penetrate the aerial defense system of Israel. That is why what they claim that they have hit the army Golan Brigade's headquarters or the offices there in both the cities, though Israel denies it, and this is another tactic of warfare, that whosoever is attacked, whether it's Iran, Israel, Hezbollah in Lebanon, they will all try to downplay it despite the footage or the visuals being there. But the latest in this entire escalation between Israel and Hezbollah is that both Israel and Lebanese Prime Minister have approached France, because France had been a previous colonizer in Lebanon. It has good relations with the Lebanese government, and both the parties, the Hezbollah in Lebanon, and Israeli Prime Minister Mr. Netanyahu have approached France to be the mediator and to ensure that there is no sort of escalation on the northern border of Israel, because Israel is already facing a war with Iran. There are attacks from Yemen by Houthis. Then you are already fighting the Gaza war with Hamas. So Israel doesn't want to escalate or get entangled in a war from multiple fronts, and that is why after initial exchange of rockets between the 2 countries, from Hezbollah in Lebanon and from Israel's on its northern border, Israel is not interested to escalate it. Perhaps that is why both the parties are trying to show that they have inflicted maximum damage on their rival.
As always, Ghazali, thank you so much for breaking down the details for us. Let's switch tracks now. The British Prime Minister arrived in Poland to meet Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk and the Secretary General of the NATO Defence Alliance, and promised more money to support Ukraine. The UK will provide an additional £500 million to Kiev on top of the £2.5 billion allocated for this financial year. Rishi Sunak wants to emphasise the UK's role in defending Ukraine. The US Senate, meanwhile, passed $95 billion in war aid to Ukraine, Israel and Taiwan, bringing the bill to the brink of passage after months of delays and contentious internal debate over how involved the United States should be abroad. The vote to end a filibuster drew the support of 80 senators. 10 more than supported the bill when the Senate first passed it in February, virtually guaranteeing that the bill will soon reach the US President Biden's desk. And now I'm told that bill has now been passed.
Ukraine is struggling against Russia 2 years after the war began. In a bid to counter Russia, the West is swooping in to rescue Ukraine amid ammunition shortages along the front line and more, after months of stalled foreign aid. In the latest, the UK pledged arms worth $620 million to Ukraine as Prime Minister Rishi Sunak visited Warsaw, meeting NATO leaders where he made the announcement.
We will send Ukraine an additional £500 million, hitting £3 billion of support this year, and will provide them with the largest ever package of UK military equipment. This will include more than 400 vehicles, 4 million rounds of ammunition, 60 boats and offshore raiding craft, vital air defences, and long-range, precision-guided Storm Shadow missiles.
Similarly, the US Senate also voted overwhelmingly to move ahead with $95 billion in war aid to Ukraine, Israel and Taiwan, bringing the four bills to the brink of passage. This aid package includes $61 billion foreign aid to Ukraine, including a $1 billion military aid package.
Today, those in Congress who stand on the side of democracy are winning the day. To our friends in Ukraine, to our allies in NATO, to our allies in Israel, and to civilians around the world in need of help, help is on the way.
After months of facing economic turmoil and military shortages in a 2-year-long war which has devastated the country, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky breathed a sigh of relief as several crucial foreign aid packages are finally on their way to Kyiv.
Сьогодні є також вкрай потрібна хороша новина про військові пакети від партнерів. Є новий пакет від Великої Британії – $500 мільярда. Деталі ми обговорили з прем'єр-міністром Сунаком. І головне – вчасно поставити зброю в Україну. Ракети саме такі, які потрібні, бронетехніку, яку очікують на фронті, ППО, а також катери для захисту нашої економічної безпеки у Чорному морі. Дякую, Британії.
As foreign aid to Ukraine starts to trickle in, Russia has threatened to step up strikes, specifically on depots for Western weapons.
Соразмерно угрозам, создаваемым Соединенными Штатами и их союзниками, продолжим совершенствовать состав и структуру вооруженных сил, увеличивать выпуск наиболее востребованных образцов вооружения и военной техники. Повысим интенсивность ударов по логистическим центрам и базам хранения западного оружия.
As the war rages on, only time will tell how this new batch of aid actually helps Ukraine. With Disha Bagchi, Parmeshwar Bava for NDTV.
Let's turn our attention to the other story we're tracking. NASA's Voyager 1 phoned home from 15 billion miles away. NASA's Voyager 1 probe, the most distant man-made object in the universe, is returning usable information to ground control following months of spouting gibberish. This is what the US Space Agency has announced. The spaceship stopped sending readable data back to Earth on the 14th of November last year, even though the controller could tell it was still receiving their commands. But in March, teams working at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory discovered that a single malfunctioning chip was to blame and devised a clever coding fix that worked within the tight memory constraints of its 46-year-old computer system. But launched in 1977, Voyager 1 was mankind's first spacecraft to enter the interstellar medium in 2012 and is currently more than 15 billion miles from Earth. Messages sent from Earth take about 22.5 hours to reach the spacecraft. And switching tracks to Greece now, where skies over southern Greece turned an orange hue as dust clouds blown across the Mediterranean Sea from North Africa engulfed the Acropolis as well as other landmarks. Now, strong southerly winds carried the dust from the Sahara Desert, giving the atmosphere of the Greek capital a Martian-like filter, as you just saw, in the last hours of daylight. The skies are predicted to clear as on Wednesday, This is because winds are expected to shift and move the dust with temperatures dipping. But the strong winds over the past few days have also fanned unseasonal early wildfires in Greece's south part. The news and updates continue in a moment. We're slipping into a very short break. Welcome back. We have an extraordinary guest joining us on the show. Theoretical astrophysicist Priyamvada Natarajan is a leader in the efforts to map the universe's invisible contents, which is to say almost everything. Priyamvada Natarajan was featured in Time magazine's 2024 list of 100 most influential people. And as you know, the prestigious list includes global leaders, titans of industry, athletes, media superstars, and pioneers in creative fields. Ms. Natarajan says she's one of those people who are looking to understand and make sense of the grandest things in the universe, which luckily, given who we are and where we are technologically and scientifically, are actually comprehensible. Priyamvada Natarajan joins us on the World 24/7 at the moment. Thank you so much, Mr. Natarajan, for joining us live. At Yale, where she's a faculty member since 2000, Ms. Natarajan is a professor and chair of astronomy and professor of physics in Yale's Faculty of Arts and Sciences. First of all, ma'am, congratulations about the Time honor. I read that you suspected that the email from the magazine's editor might be spam when you initially received it?
That's right. I was pretty stunned when I heard from them. You know, as a scientist, although I am a thought leader and I'm a sort of public intellectual, this is not something you actually anticipate at all. So when I heard from them, I thought something has to be wrong. Although I wrote to them saying, I'm super grateful and really stunned, but is this for real? So, yeah.
Ma'am, but from Coimbatore to Cambridge to Yale, it's been an absolutely incredible journey for you. We know you grew up loving science and math, but what was your childhood like in India? Were you always fascinated with celestial, terrestrial, any kinds of maps?
Yeah, so I was obsessed with maps since I was a young kid. So I would devour any atlases of any kind that were around. And I think there was this notion that I felt that being able to map something means that you can know it and you can understand it. So I was always so curious. And I don't mean curious as an euphemism for naughty. I was actually just genuinely curious. You could ask my mother that. And I was, of course, quite bookish. But I think that, I was just devouring books. I grew up, I was very fortunate. As I often say, I won the birth lottery with my parents and my family. I grew up in a house full of books and enormous support and encouragement, both from my parents. And I had a wonderful educational experience in my schooling in India, and then I left for college. And I left only because I couldn't at the time. I left in the late 80s, where it was hard to get scholarships. You had to get a full scholarship to leave the country. But I left only because at that time, it was not possible to do research as an undergraduate.
Right.
And I was hooked on research already. As a high schooler, I had started doing research at the Nehru Planetarium in New Delhi. So, I'm so grateful and excited and thrilled. I'm already in New York. The festivities start tomorrow. So I was sort of dashing from dinner to come and talk to you right now.
Oh, thank you so much for making time for us. Ma'am, your work maps the invisible universe. If you could take our viewers through what that entails.
So it turns out that some of the dominant components of our universe are actually invisible, as in they don't emit light directly. So you can't actually see them and study them like stars and galaxies that have visible light. So these entities are dark matter, dark energy, and black holes. So you infer their presence indirectly from the gravitational effects that they actually exert around their vicinity. So for example, black holes, they are actually a region of space where the gravity is so intense that not even light can escape. But they impact the region around them. They affect the motions of stars that stray close by, for example. And we also know that every galaxy in our universe happens to host one of these supermassive black holes. So we study indirectly from the effects. And similarly for dark matter, from the bending of light. So I've been involved in trying to develop the conceptual frameworks for how you would actually do that, how you would do this inference, how you would do this modeling. And of course, now over the last 10, 15 years, and specifically since last year, we have a fantastic data from space, from the Hubble Space Telescope, from the Chandra Space Telescope, and the James Webb Space Telescope. And in particular, I was super excited, right? As a theorist, I sort of make predictions. And
Yes.
so what is super exciting about science right now is that you can be alive, and in your lifetime, these predictions can be tested and validated. And of
exciting
course,
indeed.
I'm super lucky that one was validated last year.
Right, ma'am, as we wrap, if you could make one change to help women at work, what would it be?
To persist, no matter what the odds are. Yeah.
That's a great parting shot. Thank you so much, Ms. Rajan, for joining us on NDTV and making time for us.
Oh,
Well, thank you for investing your time and watching this edition of The World 24/7. We'll keep tracking the latest developments for you. Do stay tuned.